My pleasure to introduce our next presenting company, Belgrave Oil and Gas, and Dr. John Belgrave. Dr. John Belgrave has more than 30 years of experience advising on enhanced oil recoveries on a large-scale basis for companies like BP Canada and Encana, as well as national oil companies all over the world. We're pretty excited to hear what he has to say. And you may have seen some of his work yesterday with Sinclair Group Energy Texas and the projects that they're doing. So we're excited to hear a little bit more about the technology that we're doing on the EOR front with light air oil injection. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. John.
Good afternoon. A couple of acknowledgements. Very grateful to Enercom. I'd like to acknowledge my partners there with Sinclair Energy Group Texas, Hank Sinclair, Terry Welch, Robert Tormey. We're very excited about what we're doing here. If you're technical, I'm hoping that I'm going to recalibrate your thinking just a little bit. If you're financial, I hope to demonstrate the efficacy of what we're doing. Yeah? It's a tall order for a single presentation, but I've tried to high grade the main points here, okay? All right, so essentially I'm going to cover these three points here. The first one is I'm going to spend a bit of time building the case for air injection, and I need to demystify that technology. A lot has been said about it. There's much that you don't know, and I'm just hoping that I leave you with a solid impression of what this thing can do for us. Yeah? The other thing is I want to introduce you to a platform, proprietary platform that we have here, and the competitive advantage that it brings for us, it really high grades opportunities for us. It provides us with interactive and dynamic guidance for implementing enhanced oil recovery, the technology of choice. And then I want to show you that because of that platform, we have what I like to say is unprecedented visibility, operational levers for guiding us along various paths to profitability. Now, this is a lot for one presentation, so I'm going to try to take it a bit slowly. Okay, so let me walk you through this. What I'm focusing on here is mature, depleted reservoirs. So stay with me on this, please. If you look at the technologies available for exploiting reservoirs, by and large, you've got essentially single well processes, and you've got multi-well processes. I'm going to take them sequentially. So when you talk about a single well process, you're talking about stimulation. And for stimulation to work, you need to have reservoir energy. That means you need to either have reservoir pressure, or the sands themselves, the formation, must be thick for gravity to cough the oil up. In a depleted reservoir, the chances are you don't have this. I was in the Middle East one time, and I heard a service company with a large global presence mentioned to one of the NOCs that they should try some type of stimulation. Stimulation will not work if the reservoir doesn't have the energy to bring the oil back. In a mature, depleted petroleum province, that is not an option. You're just throwing your money away. So it means that we probably have to look at some type of flood. So flood is a multi-well process. If you look at it there, the recovery factor, and this is pretty important, is, and you all know this from petroleum school if you're a technical person, it's composed of three components. You have something called the aerial sweep efficiency. That's the area that you contact. That is largely a function of the disposition of the wells and the way you configure things. You've got the vertical sweep efficiency, which is the EV there, and that has to largely do with the sedimentology, the geological framework. And the displacement efficiency that is more or less process dependent. Now these three components, they're coupled, they're multiplied by each other. So if you have a fall down in one of those items, it affects you. Okay, so I'm going to be concentrating on the vertical sweep and the displacement efficiency as I build this case for air injection, the efficacy of air injection. Okay? All right, so displacement efficiency is a key factor and is process dependent. Okay, so I'm going to talk about different technologies that people would jump to the minute they've got their hands on a property. The first thing they're going to think about is probably water flooding or some type of polymer injection flooding. And if you look at the displacement efficiency in a water wet system or a mixed wettability system, you see that you have residual oil saturations to water or polymer that are in the 30s and low 40s if it's a water wet system, and you have high 20s and so on. Now, let's say you're in a depleted reservoir. You've got a 50% oil saturation to start with, and you're going to leave about 35% oil saturation in the ground. 50 minus 35 is 15 over 50. That's a 30% displacement efficiency. So you're already hamstrung in terms of displacement efficiency, and you now have to contend with your vertical and your aerial. So you're limited here just by the displacement efficiency. If you look at carbon dioxide injection, flooding, now a lot has been said about that. It's a pretty compelling thing for a lot of reasons, but you should know, if you're not familiar, the price of carbon dioxide is indexed to the price of oil. I was working for Encana with Weyburn. That's a very mature CO2 flood. And when the oil price hit $140, we were paying through our noses for CO2, okay? It's indexed to the price of oil. Now, so that's the first thing. So if you're going to spend money for CO2, you have to have a good reason to put it in the ground, point number one. The second thing is, let's look at the efficacy of putting CO2 in the ground. This here is, forget this one here. This is drilling down into the thermodynamic weeds of the process. We don't want to go there. Let's talk about this table here. This is from the National Petroleum Council, United States. And what it says here is that for different oil gravities, if you're less than 27 degrees API, you need about 4,000 psi reservoir pressure in the ground for miscibility, to be able to flush all of the oil out. If you're greater than 30, it drops to about 1,200 psi. Now, in depleted reservoirs, you don't have that pressure, so you're not going to have miscible displacement. I'm not saying that there's no benefit to putting CO2 in the ground. You could swell the oil, so you're going to get some modest incremental recovery, but you're not going to flush the oil out of the system. And there's probably a tax advantage to sequestering CO2. There may be a lot of reasons for doing this, but optimal recovery is not one of them. Okay, so another one that they kick about is surfactant injection. Now, I tell you this, I've seen all sorts of EOR. Chemical EOR is the most complicated process. Okay, you have something called the formulation of micelles. These surfactant molecules have to come together and surround the oil and emulsify it and push it out. And you have to deal with the surface active nature of clays and the chemistry of the water that can really eat your lunch. You can lose 90% or so of the surfactant you put in ground in a non-productive way. So you have to do things like pre-flushing and all sorts of things, and you have to jack up the surfactant concentration to overcome that liability. That's one point. China is the largest country in the world that produces oil by chemical injection. I've been there and I've seen it. One thing that they discovered is that when you get the oil out of the ground, the emulsifying agents that leach the oil out of the ground in the first place, You need some sort of different surfactant to break those emulsions at surface once it's making its way to the tanks. There's one field they couldn't even sell the oil. This is what it is. It becomes a very difficult thing. So you have to know what you're doing here. Okay? Okay, so those are some of the issues there. And let's talk about steam flooding. Most times, steam flooding is initiated as a primary process. That's because the cost of the steam, to justify it, you have to have high oil content. And the other thing is that the high oil content will justify the close spacing of the wells needed for the process. The thing about steam is when you inject it in the ground, it starts to condense. And there's a maximum distance that you can push it before it's all hot water. And then you lose the displacement capabilities of the steam once it converts to hot water. In a mature depleted reservoir, you don't have the oil content, so it means you are mandated to space your wells far apart. And if you have to space the wells far apart, you can't push the steam that distance, so steam flooding is not an option. Okay, so now we get to air injection. Now I really have to slow down because I need to demystify this technology. You've heard high pressure air injection. You've heard fire flooding. You've heard in situ combustion. And then you've heard air injection. Let's call it air injection because that's what it is. The process behaves differently depending on the gravity of the crude, depending on the reservoir pressure, depending on the reservoir temperature. But it has been given a very bad rap because not many people understand it. When you feel marginalized and you cannot contribute to a conversation, you know, all sorts of myths and so on begin to develop. I can tell you that this process, and I will try to demonstrate it to you, has worked everywhere. It is, in my opinion, the most versatile of all the enhanced oil recovery technologies. You have complete control. If you drive a Porsche or if you drive a fancy car, you know the power under the hood, but you have control. You can take your foot off the gas and you can step on the brake. It's the same thing with this. Let me just tell you how this thing is initiated and just get into it and show you how robust this thing is. The way you do it, what you see here is a cross-section of a reservoir. You see an injection well, and you have some producers on the side. The way you do it is, there are different ways to initiate this process, and I'm going to tell you more about that in the next slide. But let's just say we ignite the reservoir in an injection well. And it sounds as though it's Star Wars and so on, but it's not. If the reservoir is deep like Harold Ham stuff in North Dakota, which they've been doing for close to 40 years, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, the oil will spontaneously ignite. And then if you feed it the correct amount of air, you will propagate a reaction zone about 6 inches or so in length, and it will move through the reservoir and flush the oil out. Okay? Now, we have a lot of indicators to tell us the health of this process. We look for things like 12 to 15% CO2 in the producing wells. That tells us everything is hunky-dory. It's moving, it's displacing oil. Once you see that, you know the oil is moving. You have other indicators too, like pressure drop and all sorts of different things. If the CO2 content drops, you're not feeding it sufficient air, and you're losing your displacement capabilities. So we understand the physics and the dynamics and whatnot. So there's another aspect to this. What you see here is the swept region here, and that is a zone of alteration, but actually it's about 6 inches that's just moving through there. And we don't allow this thing to get to the producing wells. We're smart. We know exactly how this thing should work. We know that when the combustion zone or the zone of high reactivity, we know when it's moving in a certain direction, we see the gases, we see the CO2, all that sort of stuff. We know. And if we want to force it to go another way and tell you this thing is simple. You can choke a well back and you can start sucking on the sucker rod here, and you can direct this thing. The combustion zone moves in the direction of where the flue gases are going. We have complete visibility on this thing. There's another aspect of this. There's a lot of heat here left as this thing moves, and that heat is essentially wasted, so there's a variation of the process here which is magical when it comes to improving the economics and the acceleration of oil recovery. We'd inject water here behind this zone while we're injecting air, and the water picks up all of this heat and it turns to steam, and it's an in situ steam generator without all the attendant heat losses and surface issues and whatnot. It transports that heat forward. I'm going to show you how rapidly the oil is recovered. So that's what we call another operational lever. Yeah? Now this here is a metal pipe. It's called a combustion tube for laboratory investigation of the process. And I believe this was at Texas University. In Calgary, we have bigger ones, much bigger. We look at this thing on a bigger scale, 3D boxes and all sorts of things. What you see here is the process that was stopped. What happened? We did the test in this tube, and then we unpacked it, and we took the sand out. So what you see here is the sand in the region where the front passed. So this is completely de-oiled. It's 100% displacement, and this works at any pressure, any reservoir temperature, any conditions of any kind. This process does not suffer the limitations of other processes. And I'm just trying to make sure I capture a lot of this so I don't let you go with any uncertainties about the thing. And this is a transition zone, and that's the oil that's unswept. So the thing was allowed to progress along the tube like this. It was quenched to observe the displacement efficiency. Now let me say one more thing. You pay a small price. You burn a small fraction of the oil to propagate this combustion zone. And the small fraction is equivalent to about 8 saturation points. So it's not 100% displacement in a 1D system like this. It might be 92% displacement efficiency, but you're not subject to the vagaries of reservoir conditions. This is what it is. It's a simple enough to say that the lighter the oil is the less of it you burn. That's less of the price. The heavier the oil, the more of it you burn. But when you put water behind it, it has an amazing impact on the displacement efficiency. In other words, the amount of oil you consume determines your compression cost, how much air you have to put in there, and the less you consume means less air you need. And we have control over that, and I hope to cement that a little later on. Okay, this is a picture I took in Romania. We're igniting this well electrically. So the way it works is you will lower, this is what we call a poor boy thing, yeah? It's a little shed here with a compressor and whatnot, and this is a tripod, and we have lowered a little electric, and this is shallow stuff. We have lowered a little electric heater into the well, and we're injecting air, and we'll probably do it for a week or so to just ensure that we get vigorous combustion, and the thing takes off, and then we'll dismount this, and we'll take this away, and we just feed it air. This is called electrical ignition. You do this in shallow reservoirs. If it's deeper, you lower a downhole gas burner because you don't have to deal with the high electrical resistance losses. You lower a downhole burner into the well, and the burner, I've done this in Canada, this is not rocket science. And it would heat the air, and the hot air will go into the reservoir, and it will ignite it, and once you see the CO2 and whatnot, you shut this thing down, you drive off the location, you just continue to inject air, and the process is proceeding. I've also ignited reservoirs chemically. Linseed oil is a plant-based extract. It's highly flammable. You can inject a couple barrels of this thing into the reservoir and then pump air. The process will take off. You can inject a little bit of steam to heat the near wellbore environment, inject air. The process will take off. We have lots of triggers to set this thing up, depending on jurisdiction. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that. Now, this is an interesting slide. We've been doing air injection for years. Over 100 projects have been in existence, and yet I've never seen this in the technical literature. I prepared this myself. What this is, it's a histogram showing all the projects. This is permeability, the range of permeabilities where this thing has been successful. And I should have removed technically successfully. I just didn't want to, I wanted to hedge my bets. But this is permeability, all the way up to 11 Darcy's. This is North and South Dakota. The North and South Dakota project was so tight that Harold Ham and his guys, they couldn't even inject water. It was so tight. The only thing that they could have injected was some type of gas. There was no CO2. And so they went with air, and the thing has been tremendously successful. The nice thing about being able to inject some type of gas is that the patterns can be a lot larger because gas has a low viscosity. You have the injectivity. You can reduce your well count, improve your profitability. That's a nice thing about being able to inject the gas. Look at these things. Look at the viscosities. Viscosities as low as 0.8 centipoise all the way up to over 100,000. My first job after PhD school was in Wolf Lake, Alberta. We have violated all the constraints in the reservoir engineering books that says we can't do this, can't do that. All these books need to be rewritten. The books will tell you that you need to operate below 5,000, below 3,000 centipoise. We have done it here successfully. In fact, we saved our jobs by doing it in 100,000. We were getting 15% recovery factor by steam in that reservoir, and we put the air in there after the steam, and it doubled the recovery factor, and all the jobs were saved. First job in Canada. And look at depth, very shallow depths. That shallow depth there would be Romania. That project has been going on for close to 40 years. Heavy oil. Primary recovery 9%, recovery with air injection 58%. This project here, that's one of the deepest projects in North America. The Chinese are doing a lot deeper also. This is in West Heidelberg in Mississippi. That was a really fantastic project. They did the combustion, the air injection, what do you want to call it, and then the carbon dioxide that were coming out, they captured it and they injected it in another part of the reservoir. Zero emissions. They were using the flue gas as an impure form of CO2, putting it in there. They got additional recovery. Yeah? And of course, there's pay thickness here. A range. So what I'm trying to show you here is the range of geological and reservoir conditions where this thing has been successful. It's been more successful than that. Okay, so now I have to take this a bit slowly here. Air injection has been successfully applied after steam injection. The residual oil saturation to steam is substantial. It takes a very, very long time. In a SAGD chamber, I was doing SAGD for Encana some years ago. And I went and I drilled and cored the SAGD steam chamber. And then I took those saturations and I put in a combustion tube test. And the test showed that it's still displacing oil. We have done this successfully. We did it in Wolf Lake, St. Novus in Canada. They are doing it. So it's viable, extremely viable after steam injection. You have done it here in the United States after water flooding twice. Onshore Gulf of Mexico, West Hackberry, active water drive, 50% recovery on primary. Amoco, who was very bullish on air injection, they started injecting air in the top and improved the recovery factor to close to 90% of the oil. Amoco also did it in Sloss Field in Nebraska after a very, very successful water flood, which brought the oil saturation down to about 24%. In a $3 a barrel price environment, they went in there and still recovered an additional 30% of the oil remaining in the ground. What I'm saying here is the technology is very efficient at rehabilitating mature depleted reservoirs under a variety of situations. Okay, so we said enough about that. Okay, so I want to tell you of a little bit of our unique approach our proprietary platform. I have to say that the idea for this was conceived, and I have to give credit to the US Department of Energy. About 25, 30 years ago, they conceived of a framework for putting all these things together to have one, and it was an attempt to, I guess, address the need for more detailed engineering and financial insight into how this thing worked. There were a lot of errors and flaws associated with it. We have taken this thing to three or four quantum levels over that initial attempt. So anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge that this thing has been attempted historically. What it is I want to, so that was just laying the groundwork for what I'm going to say here. When you look at screening criteria, all the reservoir engineers here, you'll see a book, a static page in every reservoir book. Greater than so many feet thickness, less than so much viscosity, so much oil saturation. Those things do not reflect the current conditions. And additionally, a lot of those criteria were based on companies already having a well infrastructure to piggyback on to do enhanced oil recovery or tertiary recovery. There's no mention of oil price. So what it is what you read in a book there, what I would say is woefully inadequate. Like I said, we have violated all of the constraints imposed upon us by some of these authors, okay? They're not relevant. You need to tear that page out. This is what it is. What it is, the other thing that they don't reflect is, if we're going into abandoned fields, we have to contend with the fact that there's no legacy infrastructure or wells available for us to piggyback on. So we need to have complete technical and financial visibility to proceed. And that's why we set this thing up. Okay, it's robust, highly comprehensive, and very fast. Okay, so just give you a little bit about the internals of the thing, the anatomy of the platform. What we do is we consider everything, the rock and fluid properties, and we make sure that we have sufficient physics to account for eventualities like wet combustion or wet air injection, and so on. Now, we need to have like all the combustion parameters depending on the gravity of the oil. This is an important part here, extremely important, because it tells us that there's a certain size of reservoir that we need to go after so that we can have sufficient running room. The thing about the economics of capital development projects is that you need to be able to reuse your facilities once you've put them in place. You don't want to have peak oil production where you only use that capacity one time for a few months. You want to be able to reinvest your capital. So you need to be able to configure your scheduling and your development of these projects, and you need to have that a priori information. What you see here is some of the other things, all the drilling costs, fiscal regimes, taxes, the net present value, internal rate of return, recycle ratio, and this thing actually, once you get all the information, it turns around in less than a second. It gives you complete visibility in the scheduling, the development profile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can't get into that now. Okay, another point here. We have, I may run 2 minutes over. Okay, God bless you. What it is here is that we have complete, we have a lot of historical knowledge. I'll tell you something. In the 90s, the US Department of Energy sponsored a biannual conference every 2 years in Tulsa. And I tell you this, the same 300 people every 2 years would turn up. Hungary, Venezuelans, Romanians, Canadians, United States, everybody would turn up. And we all knew each other. And we shared the information, and we had we really knew, it was a really hardcore group of people who understood this technology. Since with the cyclic upheavals in oil price and so on, that thing fell apart. Nobody has taken it over. But it's a bit unfortunate. So what I'm trying to say is that the body of knowledge is extremely fragmented. And if people ask why is no one doing this, it's because there's no one who has a comprehensive helicopteric view of what's available or what has been done. This is just one slide here to show you. These guys here, Garn and Weigel, back in 1974, they did a complete spectrum of experiments from 9.6 degrees API all the way up to 48 degrees API on all of these oils, wet and dry combustion, and the correlations are there, the information is there. There's a lot of it available. Okay, this is a little bit on the mechanistic approach that we have taken. And like I said, this thing is really incredible. You'll find it in something very similar in the book by Bourget and those guys, the French guys from French Petroleum Institute, what have you. And what it is that it's a model that looks in cross-section, the combustion zone, the burn zone, the steam zone ahead of it, and the hot water zone underneath it, because you do have combustion water being generated from the combustion reactions. So there's a zone of steam ahead of it, and then you have the CO2 and the nitrogen having a gas flood. So the oil produced has contributing components from the gas flood, the steam flood, flushing with the burn zone, and some hot water below. This is what's built into that screening thing. And this is what's interesting here. This is Stanford University's model. This is a 40-acre pattern, oil saturation 40%, reservoir thickness 50 feet, and it's a 5-spot pattern. You've got 4 producers, injector in the middle, and this is the oil production profile as predicted by the Stanford model. It's good, it works, it makes a lot of sense. It is an empirical correlation that is from field data and combustion tube tests. Unfortunately, it's not mechanistic. It doesn't allow us to inject water with it and see the effects of all these things. This is our mechanistic approach. The peak oil is pretty much similar, the profile looks similar, except that we have the ability to reproduce the part that when the steam breaks through at the producing well. Why is that important? It's important for a number of reasons. Let me just mention this. This profile is generated by constant air injection. This is a very important takeaway. Constant air injection throughout the entire time frame, the life of this pattern. Now, if you're injecting a constant rate of air injection and your oil rate is here at this point, think about what your operating expense per barrel looks like. If the oil production is high here and you have a certain compression cost, it's going to be much lower than when the oil rate is down here. So what this is saying is that your operating costs are going through the roof. So the early barrels are cheaper than the later barrels. That's what this says. And so it means that we have the ability to decide when we divert our compression capacity to another pattern. We don't have to follow this oil production curve all the way down. We don't have to. We can deploy our air injection capacity somewhere else. That's one point. We have control. The second point is this. If you stop it here or you stop it here, if you stop it higher up, that tends to increase your F&D a little bit, but it reduces your op costs substantially. So operating in this manner, we have the ability to transfer dollars to and from F&D, to and from operating expense, depending on the oil price. It's all a thing about maximizing the financials here. Okay? Not going to talk too much more about that. I just wanted to show you the steam. This is in Romania. You can see the steam arriving here. I was in China one time, and I was in Liaohe, Panjin, the heavy oil field. They were doing combustion. They said, Dr. Belgrave, why is it when the steam breaks through, the oil rate goes down and it stays low? I mean, that's common sense, but you know, they weren't very theoretical. But once the steam breaks through, it's just residual oil saturation that's being produced there. And so we have captured all of that. Okay, I'm almost done, so just hang tight just a little bit. What it is here is we have 2 geological settings that are prevalent. We can have this is a cross-section of a reservoir injector producer. We can have a situation where we have good, or let's say, hydraulic communication vertically, rate communication. Or we can have a situation where it's laminated and segmented, so we don't have vertical communication. We just have these layers. We've got all of this embodied in our platform. So that's one thing. And if you're a real techie sort of person, we captured that with the Dijkstra-Parsons coefficient. It's a log normal permeability distribution. You can get that. You can get that. Okay, so I want to talk about this one because I want to make an important distinction with respect to low pressure and high pressure air injection. Stay with me on this one. If you're familiar with the Van Luceren override model, what this is, it's a number that tells you the tendency for a gas to override oil in a displacement process. And it's computed by the ratio of the viscous or horizontal forces versus the tendency for fluids to segregate vertically. If the gravitational forces are greater, you get immediate override. If you're injecting fast and you're creating that horizontal push, you will get a better, higher vertical displacement efficiency. So what this says is, according to this ratio, the lower the pressure, the greater the volume that the air occupies downhole, and that improves the sweep efficiency. If the reservoir pressure is high, that reduces the vertical sweep efficiency. We have some controls. We can increase the rate and offset. We have all of those controls. But what I want to say is that the depleted reservoirs in South Texas, this is a favorable situation in terms of displacement efficiency and oil recovery. Okay, so we will get on with that. I got like 2 more slides or something. I wanted to show you something here. These are some laboratory tests. This is time. This is oil recovery. This is the cumulative recovery curve from dry air injection. This is the one here from wet combustion. See what's happening here. At any particular time, you got like almost double the oil or 50% more oil or something. Water does a hell of a lot. This is one of the operational levers for directing us to different paths to profitability. That's that point. Okay, and there's some other things there we don't need to talk about. Okay, so this is my penultimate slide. So we have essentially 3 operational levers. The first one is well spacing. We're able to use that as a control because gas has very low viscosity. When Harold Ham in North and South Dakota started it, he was using 320 acres. He can push that thing out as far as he wants to push it, okay, depending on, certain constraints or whatnot. So I'm saying that's one of the levers. The second one is the air-oil ratio before we divert compression capabilities. And the third one is the water-air ratio, whether you use water with the air or not. We can pick and choose from this to maximize oil recovery and profitability under varying scenarios. The technology is very flexible. And the platform that we have allows us this visibility before we select the reservoir, before we acquire it, or to dynamically improve on an existing implementation. Okay, also some conclusions here to that finally. Okay, so we've got this mechanistic approach embodied in our screening criteria and our platform. And what I'm trying to say is that we have a lot of visibility because there's an historical legacy of information available. And finally, we have a lot of levers that can direct us towards profitability. And those are just some of the places that I've consulted for. A lot of people are doing this clandestinely and surreptitiously. It's happening. Russians just built a $10 million lab. I've been there. I was there for the inauguration. Colombians are doing it. They just, $100 million project. God, who else? The Chinese, Canada. We're doing things that are just violating all the rules. You're doing it in the United States, Belarus, Russian Federation. 2 projects in India that I'm going there to work on, Mexico. They're all doing it. So don't let anyone tell you, why isn't it being done? It's being done. It's just the rest of us are asleep, yeah? Thank you. I can take some questions now if you got any. If not, have a great weekend, yeah?
Dr. Belgrave.